So, welcome everybody to this very important debate, the webinar on avoiding the next pandemic, what role for Europe? I would like to welcome you very warmly on behalf of the board of Friends of the Global Fund Europe and its chair, Laurent Vigier, who cannot be with us today. My name is Christoph Ben. I'm also serving on the board of Friends Europe, together with many of my fellow board members who will be on the panel today. Otherwise, I'm working with the European think tank on global health, the Job Lange Institute based in Amsterdam and Geneva, where I serve as director for global health diplomacy. So delighted to have you all, on this webinar, very timely. I think, the pandemic has not gone away, and the Friends of the Global Fund Europe have paid great attention to this topic of pandemic preparedness, has a clear position that we need a clear global health architecture for better pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. We also believe that the Global Fund should be a core partner for this global health architecture. But I think it's also important to remember that we are having this debate at a particular point in time. With a terrible war in the Ukraine that occupies obviously the minds of all political decision makers in Europe, and the budgetary consequences of this war, the direct and indirect impact will just be huge. And I think we all experience that when we talk to policymakers in all European countries. But at the same time, we know that the COVID pandemic is not over yet, and the world needs to be better prepared for any next pandemic. So therefore, this topic is not going away, although it seems to slip a little bit in terms of the political attention that it deserves. So therefore, I do believe that this discussion today is even more timely than when we started to prepare for this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We have an outstanding panel that I will introduce in a minute, and you might have seen from the agenda that we have actually two sections. We'll have first 4 panelists, and then a second section that will be introduced by Charles Goerens, a long-term board member of Friends of the Global Fund Europe. I also have to say we had some regrets from people that we hoped to be on this panel, unfortunately also affecting the gender balance. But I think, we will still be very, very well served by the panelists we have. And I will introduce them as they will be speaking. And each of them has 10 minutes for their introductory remarks. And I would first like to turn to Professor Michel Kazatchkine, who absolutely needs no introduction in this audience. Obviously, everybody knows that Michel served in many different functions, but among them also as executive director of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, where I had the pleasure to work closely with Michel. But for today's discussion, also very important that Michel was a member of the WHO Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. And it is very, very important to be reminded of that important report and the recommendations. So over to you, Michel. Delighted to have you on this panel.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And can I have the first slide? And actually, while the slides are coming in, let me say, Christoph, you already made the point I was trying to make in that first slide, which is that this is not a post-COVID discussion. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, and therefore we have to discuss avoiding the next pandemic while still dealing with the current one. Next slide. And since we are, next slide, please. Can we see the slides? Yeah, the next one, please. And since we're in a Global Fund context here, let me also remind everyone that COVID-19 has affected families, communities, nations, the social and economic well-being of people across the globe, but it has had catastrophic effects on global tuberculosis control efforts and significant negative impacts on HIV testing and prevention, particularly for key and vulnerable populations. And overall, the convergence of COVID-19 and HIV has deepened inequalities and sharpened vulnerabilities. I'm making this point because addressing vulnerable populations is one of the weaknesses of preparedness to the next pandemics at this time. Next slide, but coming to the very substance of today's seminar, let me first quote from the conclusions of our independent panel that were published in May 2021. And one of the main conclusions was, it is clear to the panel that the world was not prepared and had ignored warnings, which resulted in a massive failure from an outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan, China, became within a few weeks a devastating pandemic. And indeed, my first point is we haven't been learning lessons. The SARS epidemic, 2005, the H1N1 pandemic, 2009, the Ebola outbreak, 2014, Zika, MERS, all have led to initiatives to strengthen health security. SARS actually propelled, as you will remember, negotiations to revise and broaden the international health regulations that were adopted in 2007. And as it says on the slide, since the H1N1 pandemic, at least 11 high-level panels and commissions have made specific recommendations in 16 reports to improve global pandemic preparedness. And yet, despite the consistent messages that significant change was needed, the majority of recommendations were never implemented. We actually calculated that it's less than 10% of these recommendations that have been implemented. And from a global perspective, a coalition of interests, a multilateral coalition of interests with sufficient power and momentum to achieve a package of essential reforms has never been assembled. And so the GPMB, in its recent report released at the end of last year, said that the COVID pandemic has exposed a world that is unequal, divided, and unaccountable, and the health emergency ecosystem reflects this broken world. It's not fit for purpose and needs major reform. Next slide. At national level, national pandemic preparedness has also been vastly underfunded and underestimated in national policies, despite, of course, the obvious fact that its costs is only a fraction of the cost of responses and losses incurred when an epidemic actually occurs. Many national governments lacked solid preparedness plans, core public health capacities, and organized multi-sectoral coordination with clear commitment from the highest national leadership. Next slide. And that has nothing to do with how wealthy a country may be and how apparently strong its health systems may be. This slide shows it plots death rates from COVID-19 and the joint external evaluation score of the Global Health Security Index on the abscissa. And you can see up to the right that countries such as USA and Canada, despite ranking very high in evaluation scores of preparedness, had very heavy and large death rates. And as an opposite example, you may see, let's say, that Ethiopia, with a much lower score, had very little death rates. And that is true for a number of countries outside Africa as well. So next slide. What we're learning from this is that the ranking of countries, according to the Global Health Security Index, did not predict the relative performance of countries in the COVID-19 response. And clearly, one of the measures that the index failed to account for was political leadership, trust in government institutions, and countries' ability to mount fast and adaptable responses, particularly from a social perspective. For example, while the US ranked highest actually in its aggregated score, it scored very poorly on universal health care access and in relation to public confidence in governance, which at that time received a score of 0, which indicated less than 25% confidence of the population. These were, we will remember, in the Trump administration era. Next slide. So what I'm saying here is that in terms of pandemic preparedness, we need to close a gap, but the gap we need to close requires also that we approach measuring and testing preparedness differently than we have so far. And our preparedness assessments must certainly place much more focus on the way system functions in actual conditions of pandemic stress, which means simulation exercises resulting in immediate rectification of identified weaknesses that must become routine. And the last point on this slide is that pandemic preparedness is and should be a core function of governments and of the international system to be overseen at the highest level. And this is not a responsibility of the health sector alone. Next slide. As we discuss preparedness, this slide is, or just look at the first 2 bullet points, is aimed at reminding us that we are at continuous increasing background level of risk because of the demographic growth and the current environmental stresses that are driving the increase in emerging novel pathogens. And of course, air travel and globalization now enable a virus to reach any place in the world in a matter of hours. So a new pathogen can emerge and spread at any time. The bottom of the slide, I will not go into the detail, but basically it says that the last report of the Global Health Security Index, end of 2021, has shown that very little, if no improvement, actually has taken place in the last 2 years in terms of preparedness to pandemics across the world. Next slide. So after these few minutes on preparedness, let me also say, list a few of the lessons that we learned from the early response to the pandemic. And the first one is that the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, which is the highest level of global concern specified in the internationally and legally binding health regulations, did not lead to an urgent, coordinated worldwide response. As you know, as we know in Europe, it wasn't until the number of COVID-19 cases increased dramatically and COVID-19 had spread internationally that governments somehow took serious action to prevent transmission. In Europe, health systems and health workers were not prepared for a prolonged crisis. Across the world and in Europe, we learned about how community responses and local engagement have been vital sources in the response. And then, of course, we've been struck by the huge social and economic impact of the pandemic that dependent in its intensity on pre-existing structural conditions, and of course, the amount of fiscal and governance space made available for mitigation measures in Europe. We were lucky in this respect for sure, and also the nature and timing of decisions. Overall and globally, inequality has been the main determining factor explaining why the COVID-19 pandemic has such different impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. Next slide. So let me now turn to some of the recommendations from our panel. I'm quoting our panel because I had the privilege to serve on the so-called independent panel. But these recommendations are very overlap a lot with recommendations from other groups, such as the G20 high-level finance group, such as the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board, and others. 5 main recommendations: stronger leadership and better coordination at national, regional, and international level, including a more focused and independent WHO, a pandemic treaty, which is now being negotiated or about to be negotiated, and a senior global health threats council, something that is still in the international debate. Second, invest in preparedness now and not when the next crisis hits, with, as I discussed earlier, more accurate measurements of preparedness and accountability mechanisms to spur action. 3, an improved system for surveillance and alert. 4th, a pre-negotiated platform able to produce vaccines, diagnostic and therapeutics, basically global public goods, and secure their rapid and equitable delivery. And 5, access to financial resources, both to invest in preparedness and to be able to inject funds immediately at the onset of a potential pandemic. Can you skip the next 2 slides and go to the last one? Yeah, thank you. So all of these issues are currently debated and will be debated in a number of fora. And I'm very pleased that our webinar today is one additional forum of discussion. As Christophe had said, we are in a year of global fund replenishment, and we strongly believe that the global fund has to play an important role in channeling funding for preparedness and response to countries. Funding for preparedness and response that is being discussed in Geneva as the pandemic treaty negotiation starts, will most likely be discussed in the frame of a UN General Assembly in New York, is on the agenda of the Indonesia G20 after the Rome G20, and is certainly on the agenda of the European Commission, and with the new initiative called HERA, and I'm sure we will hear about this from Anne Boucher. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Christophe.
Thanks so much, Michel, for this excellent introduction into the topic. I wished I could open the floor for questions and comments. I would be tempted myself to ask you what you felt about the status of the implementation of the wonderful recommendations that your panel came out with, but we don't have the time for that right now. We will go, to the next panelist, but thanks again. I think that was exactly right to kind of frame our discussion today. So I would like then to give the floor to Anne Boucher, who is working with the Bruegel think tank in Brussels, but also has been a Director General of the Health and Food Safety at the European Commission. And I also saw that you just published an interesting article together with our previous speaker, Michel. So I'm sure our panelists will be well aligned today. Over to you. The floor is yours, Anne.
Thank you, Christophe. Now, I mean, there's quite a lot of common understanding with Michel, and I fully subscribe to what he said. I mean, I think we all agree on recommendations, but we have the issue of finding how to get things going. And I first want to thank also the organizers. I mean, because as you say, both Christophe and Michel, I mean, it's an absolute necessity that we carry on this debate on prevention, preparedness, and response. So the issue is, what can Europe do? Yeah? And I wanted to share with you two considerations. I mean, the first one is that, first of all, that by strengthening its own prevention and preparedness efforts in Europe, as a region, it will be extremely beneficial for the world, because we will be contributing to what is needed now, which is a continuum of networking and coordination at global, regional, and national level. So I think that's quite an important element. However, and that's my second point, there are still a lot of gaps, and Michel has mentioned it in finance, in governance, in organization for global health security. And they need to be fixed, and it requires leadership. And Europe is not so good at taking leadership in this area. So let me quickly expand on these two elements. On the positive side, as I said, the EU is already strengthening its own prevention and preparedness. It has a global health security framework. It has improved it, and Michel mentioned it with the establishment of this new agency, the Health Emergency Response Authority, is a milestone. It's going to organize the ecosystem for medical countermeasures, and it has already been set up. Let's hope that it will help avoiding what we have seen with vaccine nationalism and total lack of solidarity on vaccination globally, but it's an important actor. More generally, the strengthening of surveillance at EU level is happening. The ECDC has more resources. The health budget has been increased. It has a broader mandate. What we have seen is, what we are seeing is now that there will be more funding for research linked to new pathogens and treatments. We are also seeing that integrated information systems are being put in place at European level, with a lot of IT investment taking place between the different member states. So there will be really real-time surveillance information. And I think what a very important point to have in mind is that both agencies, ECDC and HERA, have an obligation to cooperate internationally, and they have resources for this. So they will coordinate their efforts with non-EU sister organization. I think that's extremely important to have that in mind. And all these developments are taking place as we speak. So although I endorse the diagnostic that Michel made, that little has been happening at the EU level, there's a feeling that things are moving. Yeah? On the more uncertain side of the political leadership, and whether the EU can be a broker and take leadership to help strengthening prevention and preparedness, we have to recall that health is an area at the European level where national sovereignty has a very, very strong importance. So it means this is an area where member states coordinate less. In particular, when it comes to international cooperation. The EU is not a member of the WHO, while it is a member or a privileged observer in a number of organizations. What does it mean? It means that not being a part of WHO is that member states, they do not coordinate before they go to the WHO. When Germany speaks, it speaks in the name of Germany. When France speaks in the WHO, it speaks in the name of France. And we see it, for instance, now in the G20 discussions on the idea of setting up a fund of funds. The US are very much pushing for this. Germany is slowly getting there. France and Italy are very much against that. So we see that there's not a coordinated position of EU level on international global health. And that's quite, I think that's quite a gap. So there is a lot of support, there's a lot of goodwill, but I think it falls short of taking the leadership at the international level, just at the current juncture when we need a big political impetus. And I hope it could really change, but it's very important for non-EU members to be aware of these specific institutional aspects. That's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Thanks, Christophe.
Thank you so much, Anne, for very, very important comments. And I think all of us listened very carefully when you were talking about the lack of coordination in Europe. And, I think this is clearly something that we should take seriously also as a board of Friends Europe, I guess. So thanks for that. Now we're moving from Europe to Africa, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Raji Tajuddin, who is the head of the Division of Public Health Institutes and Research at African Centers for Disease Control. And Raji, I have to say at the beginning, I think, all of us in the whole world, in a sense, has, observed very closely the role of the African CDC in this pandemic with great admiration. And so congratulations to you and your team on an outstanding job over the last few years. We can just imagine how, challenging that has been. So we are delighted to have you here to kind of present your perspective from the African CDC. Welcome, Raji.
Thank you so much, Christophe. Let me also acknowledge the previous speakers who are on the same panel as me, Anne and Michelle, and to also bring you greetings from John in Kegasong, who have actually loved to be part of this, but it's on another program as I'm talking to you now. So having said that, I think this is a very important topic. I agree we are still in the middle of a pandemic. At the same time, we are discussing how do we prepare better for the next pandemic. Surely COVID-19 pandemic is not going to be the last. We're going to have many more to come. But the most important thing is how do we better position ourselves in such a way that we respond better than what we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So from the Africa CDC perspective, couple of lessons here. With the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, we have learned the importance of a national level mechanism, national level platform, the importance of national public health institutes. We have also learned the importance of workforce, public health workforce, especially community health workers, our epidemiologists. And this pandemic has further highlighted the importance of strengthening public health workforce, as a critical element in terms of guaranteeing health security, be it nationally, regionally, or even globally. We have also seen the importance of a strong or a coordinated global medical supply platform. Michelle and Andy talked about, what we have seen in terms of what has collapsed, what has worked in terms of coordination with the COVID-19 pandemic, so I won't go into that. We have also seen the importance of trying to locally contextualize whatever guideline we put out there. Africa CDC has been able to do this very well. Importance of data has also emerged. But much more importantly for us as Africa CDC, a 5-year-old institution that sits within a political organization, is the importance of political leadership. Just 1 week into the pandemic, we're able to bring all the ministers of health together. And subsequently, we're able to take the coordination of the response as a continent to the level of head of state. And the African CDC was able or was privileged to brief the African Union head of state and government more than 18 times. So they have provided the needed leadership, in terms of ensuring that each and every member state have equitable access to what we describe as all those health security commodities, like vaccines, like diagnostics, like those personal protective equipment. So without their support, I don't know what will have happened. And they actually behind the success of the continent in what they have been able to do so far as responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, going forward, in terms of what do we need to do, to prepare better, the leadership, the AU head of state and government, have come up with what we call the new public health order, and this has enjoyed a lot of support, from a lot of partners, including the EU. One is how do we ensure that we strengthen each and every public health institution on the continent? We talk of strong surveillance, we talk of strong preparedness and response, strong public health lab. We need to find a way to institutionalize that. And you can only institutionalize if you have very strong institutions on the continent. So they have tasked the Africa CDC, African Union, and partners to ensure that each and every member state have very strong national or public health institutions. Number two, we need to strengthen our local manufacturing capacity. Today, we know that only 1% of our vaccines, on the continent is produced on the continent. You will agree with me that you cannot guarantee the health security of 1.3 billion people if we can only produce 1% of your vaccine needs. So we need to find a way, and we need all the support, and we need innovative approaches to ensure that we build our local manufacturing capacity for vaccines, for diagnostics, for therapeutics, and other health security commodities. Very critical. Number three, public health workforce development is key. Without adequately trained, and adequate number of public health workforce, we cannot prevent the next pandemic. Today, as a continent, what we have in terms of number of epidemiologists, just around 2,000. And we know that the global target is to have 1 to 200,000 population. So meaning that we need 6,500. That is just epidemiologists. If you go to community health workers, the story is the same. So we need to come up with some sort of innovative way to rapidly scale up, this number. Number four, respected and action-oriented partnership, is key. I don't want to say that we have seen what some partners have done in terms of the way they approach support to our member states, But again, let's put that in the past. But going forward, we seek action-oriented and respected partnership, whereby before any support is deployed, we sit down to collectively identify the priority, the how and the when, and even the what, we jointly, define that, so that whatever that is coming is appropriately tailored in terms of support. The last but not the least for me is regionalization of intervention. There is no doubt about it. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated.
Yeah, I'm having lunch.
The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how easily the multilateral mechanism, the multilateral platform can easily collapse when it is challenged. COVAX is an excellent mechanism, but it has not worked the way we wanted it to work. In terms of diagnostics, the same thing. It has not worked the way it was, prescribed or the way it was designed to work. So meaning that we need regional mechanism. And I'm happy that Anne actually articulated what EU is doing along the line of guaranteeing their health security, the kind of governance architecture that has been put in place. And I must say here that the Africa CDC or the African Union, through the assemblies of head of state and government, are also thinking along the same line. This is not to undermine the multilateral mechanism, but rather to complement that, to strengthen that, because we have seen that, we have seen that clearly in the COVID-19 pandemic, that those regional mechanisms have worked and they can actually work. So what we should just aim at is to seek complementarity, seek synergy, in such a way that those national mechanisms, the regional mechanism, and the multilateral or the global mechanisms are able to work together synergistically. Thank you, Christoph. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Raji. That's very, very important comments that we will try to summarize a little bit after this panel and come back to that. Thank you for that. But now I would like to hand over to Peter Sens, who obviously is very well known to all of us here as the Executive Director of the Global Fund. But also, Peter, we know very well that you've been one of those who has been given lots of thoughts to kind of pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response before you joined the Global Fund and before we had the COVID pandemic. So we are really looking forward to your comments today. But I cannot introduce you without, referring to obviously what is very much a priority for the Global Fund this year, the 7th replenishment, and also the excellent news that you and the whole Global Fund partnership received yesterday from the US with the announcement of President Biden and his administration that they are requesting $2 billion for the year 2023 for the Global Fund, meaning on course for a kind of $6 billion pledge from the US. You might want to refer to that, but I wanted to mention that because this is obviously of utmost importance to Europe. And to all your supporters in Europe, because now Europe has the challenge to match that, to make sure that we are not leaving any money on the table from the US because of the 1/3, 2/3 rule. So I think we have been really thrilled to see that, as I'm sure you have been, but it's also a challenge for us in Europe that we now have to live up to. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for taking the time for our panel today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christoph. And yes, you're right. It was great news yesterday to have the US announce the administration's budget, including $2 billion, which, as you say, and the administration was very explicit, was as part of an intention to pledge $6 billion for the US to provide 33% of the $18 billion target. So yes, it sets a bar for other donors, including in Europe. You also kindly referred to my efforts before I joined the Global Fund when I was at Harvard to write about the need to be investing more in pandemic preparedness. I'm afraid I was one of the authors of the reports that Michelle referred to, which no one listened to, sadly. I'm hoping that COVID has proved more effective at making the arguments than I was. I just want to make, I think, 5 points around this topic of how we avoid the next pandemic. The first point I would make is a very powerful lesson from the COVID experience, which is that the systems and capacities to prevent, detect, and prepare to respond to the next pathogen have a huge overlap with the systems and capacities to prepare, to prevent, to detect the current pathogens, i.e. the community health workers, the public health capabilities, the laboratory networks, the supply chains, the disease surveillance systems that we use for infectious diseases like HIV, TB, and malaria, and now COVID, are the essential infrastructure in countries for preparing for the next pandemic. We could do better in making them effective for future threats by intentionally thinking about that, as opposed to, in a sense, having it as an accidental byproduct. But sometimes I get the impression when people are talking about pandemic preparedness, they talk as if it's a very discrete set of activities or investments, whereas actually it's the fundamentals of public health and primary health care that you need to be putting in place. So that's my first point. The second point is that taking an equitable and effective approach to pandemics is not just about ensuring that we have equitable access to tools, but that we have an equitable definition of what counts as a pandemic. What do I mean by that? Equitable access to tools, we have seen in COVID-19, is not something that is easy to achieve. We've had all the issues around vaccine nationalism. We've had the even sharper issues, as Raji mentioned, about access to diagnostics. We've had huge inequities in the allocation of tools. But there's also less often talked about issue about who gets to decide what counts as a pandemic. And the implicit definition of a pandemic that we often have in these discussions is a disease that is going to kill people in rich countries. Because the moment pandemics stop killing people in rich countries, we tend to use different language to talk about them. We tend to talk about them as epidemics or endemic. And that means there's a sort of dilution of the sense of urgency and the intensity of resource commitments towards them. HIV went through this evolution, TB has been through this evolution, and there are a lot of people in the global south who are worried that that's where we're going to end up with COVID, that we will end up in a situation where COVID is well controlled in the richer countries with endless series of boosters, wide availability of novel antivirals and so on, but is still causing havoc in the poorer parts of the world. And this is important to pick up on one point that Michelle stressed, which is the importance of trust. I think one of the most valuable tools in any pandemic response is the trust of the communities. And if you're not dealing with the threats that are killing people now in communities, but you're only dealing with the threats that might kill people elsewhere in the world, you're not going to win trust. And we have seen this again and again. So let's be quite thoughtful about when we talk about pandemics as to what it is we're talking about. And World TB Day was last week, and it's really important when, TB is not often thought of as a pandemic. Yet if a disease with the attributes of TB turned up tomorrow, with latent TB in about a quarter of the world, it kills 1.5 million people a year. It has a case fatality rate which is much worse than COVID, particularly among the drug-resistant variant. It has variants which are really, really scary, with mortality rates about 50%. We would call it a pandemic, but we don't, because it's killing the poor, the marginalized, and it's been around for too long. It's not kind of exciting. Third point is we have to face up to the political reality that sustaining investment in pandemic preparedness is really difficult. The world has a very short memory, and we tend to slide into cycles of panic and neglect. We panic when there's a new outbreak, and then we very quickly want to move on to the next thing and stop investing in it. And indeed, my view is that that means we have to be very smart about linking sustainable investment in pandemic preparedness to priorities that people are going to continually care about. Because if we simply rely on the kind of the rational argument that we should continue to invest in pandemic preparedness, history would suggest we won't. History will suggest we'll think of other things we want to commit our resources towards. Unfortunately, we can link pandemic preparedness to investments in things that people care about on an everyday basis, because of the fact that much of what we're talking about is essentially multi-purpose investments. The investments we make in the public health workforce that Raji talked about, the laboratory networks, the supply chains, and so on, are investments that deliver today for communities and also build and reinforce pandemic preparedness. My fourth point would be there is no one agency that be it the Global Fund, be it Gavi, be it Africa CDC, be it WHO, that is going to play every role in supporting countries and communities to get stronger in their ability to prevent, detect, and respond to pathogens. We all have roles, and the key thing is to make sure that we're working together in as complementary a way as possible. I think we've come a long way through the experience of the ACT Accelerator in improving collaboration among global agencies, but we still have work to do to define our respective roles and the most effective ways of collaborating for preparedness over the longer term. And as Raji says, we've got to get a balance between what it makes most sense to do at a country level, what it makes most sense to do at a regional level, and what it makes sense to do at a global level. The one thing I would say is that it doesn't make sense to create new entities. The global health world, and I say this as somebody who came into the global health world from outside, the global health world is already far too complicated and far too fragmented. And so the last thing we need is kind of more entities. And indeed, one of the most frequent comments we get from the ministries of health that we're working with across the 120 or so countries in which the Global Fund invests is, whatever happens on pandemic preparedness, please don't make it more complicated. Please use existing agencies and systems as far as possible, the ones we're familiar with. And then my final point, it is, as you say, our replenishment year. And we have, and this replenishment and the investment case is based on a new strategy for the Global Fund, which the board and our broader stakeholder network has been working on over the last 18 months. And the Global Fund's role in pandemic preparedness is part of that strategy and investment case. The Global Fund is the largest multilateral provider of grants for investments in health systems. And through those investments in health systems, we make a very significant contribution to countries' ability to prevent, detect, respond to future pathogens, to potential pandemics. However, in the past, arguably, we've done that more as a sort of accidental byproduct than as an intentional strategy. And I think one of the critical shifts is that the Global Fund is going to be more, in a sense, purposeful about ensuring that when we make investments, say, in diagnostic capabilities to support TB programs or in community health worker networks to support malaria, that we're also thinking through and working with our partners to ensure that there is a kind of multi-pathogen capability and surge capacity, so that we're building the benefits for pandemic preparedness into the investments we make. And this is true across multiple dimensions of what we're investing in: community health workers, surveillance systems, laboratory networks, supply chains, a whole array of components of countries' health systems. And if we can get this right, and this is a partnership and endeavor involving the countries themselves, technical partners, regional entities such as the Africa CDC, we can effectively build pandemic preparedness on a marginal cost basis, i.e., a highly efficient way of enabling countries to protect against future pathogens while delivering against the existing diseases. The other thing I would stress in the approach of the Global Fund, which I think is an important thing to bring to the whole discussion and the implementation of pandemic preparedness, is the aspects around tackling inequities, tackling human rights related barriers or gender inequalities that stop the most marginalized communities getting access to health services. This is not often part of the debate about pandemic preparedness, but I think is a critical component of how we ensure that when we want to protect people against future diseases, we are protecting everybody. We're not just protecting the privileged and the elites, but no one is left behind. I also think the emphasis on engaging communities is critical, again, to this vital ingredient in any system of pandemic preparedness, which is trust. If you don't have that trust, and we've seen it above all in the fight against HIV, that trust is such a key success factor. The Global Fund has set a target of raising 18 billion for the replenishment. Of that 18 billion, about 6 billion will be investment in systems for health, including community systems. And these will play a vital role in reinforcing the ability of countries to respond, detect, prevent the next pandemic. The Global Fund could do more, depending on how the evolution of the global debate is around how the world sort of invests in pandemic prevention. We have the mechanisms, we have the ways of working with countries and regional bodies. But I think the critical thing here is that we need to do this in a way that recognizes that in many countries, we haven't finished the fight against the past pandemics. Perhaps malaria, arguably the oldest, TB, a pandemic that is a pandemic in all but name, and HIV, the last big pandemic to strike humanity. And we can do this in a way that simultaneously defeats these old pandemics and COVID and prepares and protects against future ones. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter, for your presentation. I think very, very clear 5 points that we will come back to. I will not try to kind of summarize this very rich discussion and the presentations, but just a couple of points before handing over to the second panel. Michelle, you reminded us of the many reports that have been out there, and Peter, you've been involved in that as well. So the challenge is not, that we need more reports and recommendations. The challenge is clearly, how do we implement all the kind of very sensible recommendations that we have? And you had a number of them on your slides. So that how do we work together to kind of create this political will, so that we will be better prepared for next pandemic, even if we have this challenge that Peter also mentioned, that the world easily moves on and doesn't want to invest really, to invest in being prepared for something that is going to happen in the future. So that was setting the scene quite nicely. And you talked about the role of Europe. I think both the kind of impressive leadership that we've seen from Europe, from the European Commission, including with the creation of HERA. But you also drew our attention to the fact that Europe could often be better coordinated, on many questions you mentioned, vis-a-vis issues discussed at the World Health Assembly, but also when it comes to Europe's position towards a proposal that came primarily from the Biden administration on creating a kind of new global health security fund, or equivalent. And that obviously there are many different opinions on that, but having a more concerted kind of voice, coordinated voice from Europe would of course be helpful. Raji, you had many very important points, also alluding to the very impressive leadership that we've seen from many heads of states in Africa, from the African Union, from Africa CDC. I think there has been a very, very kind of vocal and clear voice coming from African leadership. But you also pointed out, the priorities that are left to be addressed, including supply chain, manufacturing, that I think you have all our support for that, so that the African continent will be better prepared for the next pandemic, but also emphasizing the importance of regional structures that need to be very strong in helping us to be better prepared for the pandemic. And Peter, I think, you know, it's really remarkable for somebody like you who's spent so much time thinking about that, that you are bringing us back to the fundamentals. That, you know, many people out there might think when they talk about how will we be better prepared for a future pandemic, they're looking maybe for the latest fancy idea that nobody has thought of yet, and that would kind of solve all these problems. And what you basically said was, hey, let's get back to the basics. You know, that is strong community health systems, strong primary health care. That is kind of what we will need to address this pandemic and also future pandemics. And let's learn from the lessons we have from tuberculosis and other pandemics, what we can do in the future. So I think very, very important points. Also, your points about the fragmentation that we have already in the global health architecture, to be very careful with, you know, further fragmentation, that we all hear very clearly from countries affected, that please be careful with creating new instruments, and, you know, use what we have simply to be better coordinated and reduce the kind of burden on countries. That will also be a major contribution to being better prepared for future pandemics. So thank you all so much for these invaluable contributions. And I would like to hand over to my highly respected friend and colleague, Charles Goerens. And Charles, I hope we basically kept to the time so that we are leaving, you know, the time for your very exciting second panel. Charles also, of course, you know, has been a long-term supporter of the Global Fund. We all know, former minister in Luxembourg, member of the European Parliament, but here, you know, chairing the second panel as one of the vice presidents of Friends of the Global Fund Europe. Over to you, Charles.
And I am still married, which is not the least challenging activity of mine. Thank you so much, Christoph. Dear friends, I am very happy to be able to moderate this second part of our discussion. This first panel has been, for my part, very stimulating and has given us a solid theoretical foundation that will allow us to feed, I hope, the second part of our discussion. As far as this second session is concerned, I have the honor of welcoming three new panelists today. May I introduce first Joan Valadou, Head of Human Development at the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Is replacing Ambassador Stéphanie Sédou, who is very sorry not being able to assist today's conference. And furthermore, Björn Kümmel, Chair of the WHO Working Group on Sustainable Financing and acting head of unit at Global Health, German Federal Ministry of Health. And finally, Gerrit Jenkins, Director of Advocacy, Malaria No More UK, and co-chair of the Advocacy and Resource Mobilization Committee, Rollback Malaria. May I shortly present the format of our discussion. The same question will be asked to each panelist. Then we will move to the next question. We have until 13:30 left and want to keep time for conclusive words by Stefano Vella. So please, speakers, take no more than 2 minutes to respond to each question. The first question to all panelists is the following. What key lessons or thoughts do you draw from the interventions of previous speakers? May we start with Björn Kümmel? Please, you have the floor.
So first of all, thank you very much, Charles, for chairing, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to be part of this, well, utmost important event and panel. So what key lesson can we draw from the panel already? I think there are a couple, but I'm going to go straight into the key one, I think, overall, that I see after or throughout this crisis, and that is practically one of the key lessons that we already knew from past crises, and that is that while we know many of the key lessons, for some strange reason, we are, as the world community, often unable to truly implement the decisive ones. And we are failing, to a large extent, we are failing to use the window of opportunity that is often very, very limited after a crisis such as COVID, and that potentially in this specific case currently is already closing. And so practically the window of opportunity is potentially still open. Hopefully after each geopolitical crisis, we see the emergence of new crises coming up. And obviously everybody is aware of the one major crisis that we are all facing, in particular in Europe. And it's also a health crisis with, I think, many links, TB, HIV have been raised, but obviously far beyond that. It's a huge crisis that we all are engaged in and take absolutely serious. But that crisis, or every new crisis, brings in the shrinking window of opportunity for making sure that the lessons are implemented with regards to the last crisis. So we need to use the political momentum that we still see in order really to make sure that we are best prepared for the next pandemic to come. We know there will be a next pandemic to come. It might be as harsh as COVID or even worse. I think many of the scientists or experts expected even something worse. It's clear that we are not well prepared. We remain unprepared for what is to come. And we truly need to learn from the past. And we need to use the momentum now. It will be gone next year. Charles, you're still muted. You're muted.
Sorry, I was wrong a few minutes ago by announcing John Valadou. The first panel, only two experts are requested to intervene. Björn Kümmel, thank you for your intervention. And the second is Gareth Jenkins. You have the floor for the same question, please. 2 minutes.
And thanks from me, Charles, to you for inviting us to take part in this very important event. I'll be as concise as I possibly can be. I completely agree with Björn about the window of opportunity that we have, and that, as we heard from Peter, that the memory of what we've just experienced and continue to experience could fade very, very quickly. I draw attention to a couple of other key points that we heard from the really very helpful complementary presentations. First of all is the importance of supporting vulnerable populations in the world, and in particular, supporting efforts to continue to reduce existing diseases, as well as put in place the preparation that's needed to tackle new ones. And I think Peter made that point very, very powerfully, but so did Raji as well. And there was a lot of talk about how inequality has driven a lot of the problems with the response to COVID, and that will continue into the future. And we do need to grasp that and put in place the support that's needed to help those vulnerable populations directly, but then also help the whole world be safer. I thought there was a lot of consensus around what sort of frontline capacity we need to build. And I won't repeat it too much. So the focus on community workforces, the importance of data and surveillance systems are really, really crucial. The laboratories that are needed to analyze and help understand situations as they develop. And then we also heard really about how the global architecture in many ways is broken and is not fit for purpose. And I just reflect on just how many existential challenges the world is facing right now. There were some historians who predicted as the COVID pandemic got underway that we could see a drive towards greater equality, both regionally, nationally, and at the global level, as we did after the Second World War. But that doesn't seem to be very apparent at the moment. And I think everyone has been talking about how we need more concerted political leadership in order to help grasp this opportunity that we're talking about. And I think how we articulate the future threats is very, very important. I note here in the UK that some ministers talk about the threat of pandemics being a once in a century event. And I think we definitely do need to guard against that and set out how it is a much greater threat than that in order to build on the momentum that we've talked about. But enough from me on that for now. I'll probably come back to that later.
Thanks a lot. May I move to the next speaker? To the second question, sorry. The second question to all panelists is the following. Where does avoiding the next pandemic stand on your country's agenda compared with other emergencies and priorities? Where should it stand? Now I am right by announcing John Valadou as first speaker. You have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gorenc. I'm very pleased to be with you all. Good morning, good afternoon. And sorry for having missed the interventions earlier. I just joined the meeting. On this question, a very important one, I'd like to start by saying that from the very beginning of the crisis, in a French perspective, one of the key priorities has been to have at the same time ensure a global, multilateral, rapid, and I would say aimed at solidarity response to the pandemic, with at the same time avoiding eviction effect and avoiding that this mobilization produces the effect of preventing us to carry on former investment in global health in other areas. And third, to already start to think about the lessons we can draw from the crisis. So in that regard, yes, this priority stands very high in that agenda. That's why France has been quite thoroughly involved in supporting the WHO, supporting also its reform, working on the pandemic treaty. We have, along with Germany, played a role in launching a high-level expert panel in the field of One Health, for instance. We've been quite active within G7, G20, so it has been very important on our agenda. But at the same time, as I said, and of course, we were extremely active in ensuring a rapid response, hence the role played by France and Europe in launching ACTE or COVAX, for instance. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, it was really key for us to carry on supporting organizations in global health, such as the Global Fund, and honoring our former financial contributions to those organizations, because there is a big risk of a threat on the progress achieved over the past 20 years if COVID-19 captures everything, every financial contribution and every mobilization. So there's a need to avoid eviction effect was absolutely paramount in our vision and in our action. And lastly, I would say that on our agenda, when it comes when you think about the lessons, it's also important to bear in mind the need to do more about health system strengthening, about supporting the workforce in terms of health settings. It's also a crucial aspect to bear in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Second speaker, Björn Kümmel. Please, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I don't need 2 minutes. Anne Bucher was complaining that the European member states are often not aligned when it comes to global health. In this case, we are fully aligned with the French presidency, so nothing to add. Thanks.
Thanks. And the last intervenant, Gareth Jenkins, please, for 2 minutes.
Thanks, Charles. We have seen the UK government make some key investments over the course of the last couple of years, supporting the COVID response through COVAX in particular, hosting the G7 summit last year, putting in place the Carbis Bay Health Declaration, which led to a commitment to invest in strengthen health systems. But I think we do have to face the fact that the Ukraine crisis is rightly drawing attention from our governments in a huge way, and indeed could mean that there is less financial resource available for the sorts of investments that we've been talking about today. I come back here to the need for us as a health community to work with others to try to make the case as strongly as possible as to why the threats from future pandemics are so potentially near, and as Bjorn talked about, potentially greater than the experiences of recent years, so that we can galvanize the sort of action that we need, whilst recognizing how the Ukraine crisis, the climate crisis, rightly require a huge amount of bandwidth from our governments.
Thanks a lot. The last speaker, Gary Jenkins. No, okay, no, I am wrong because I was this word. The third question to all panelists: what should be done to bring the pandemic preparedness and prevention agenda forward on the short, medium, and longer term? Jamais 203. Once again, Gary Jenkins. For 2 minutes.
Thanks, Charles. I would pay a particular attention to the importance of the 7th replenishment of the Global Fund that we've heard about today. The Global Fund Secretariat's investment case sets out very clearly that a third of the investment of the next round of funds, $18 billion, will be invested directly in strengthening health systems that will build the frontline defenses against future pandemics. So this is a really, really crucial time in the next 3 to 4 months where governments are going to make significant decisions about whether to step up to the plate in the way that we've seen the US administration or the US presidents set out yesterday, to raise the funds that are needed to respond to the impact that the pandemic has posed to tackling the 3 Global Fund diseases, but also invest in those frontline health systems that can help prevent future pandemics. And that is a big lift. It requires a 30% increase compared to the last replenishment of the Global Fund. But the case is so very strong. It is an immediate opportunity for our governments to demonstrate their intent in building a safer world for all of us from future pandemic threats. And it will require all of us to work together very, very closely to deliver that by the autumn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Björn Kummel, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. So practically, I would like to concentrate on 2 things: global health architecture and the financing. So first, to the global health architecture. And this is what I've also been saying to the working group on sustainable financing for WHO. And that is, I think the period we are undergoing currently is one of the most interesting and inspiring times for global health, at least the part that I can oversee, which is practically the past 10 years. And why? Because practically global health architecture, and in particular with regards to pandemic preparedness and response, is being reshaped currently, whether we like it or not, through different initiatives that pop up at the same time in the WHO and elsewhere. And I think the main question that we need to be fully aware of and that we need to have the right answer to is whether global health architecture, in particular with regards to pandemic preparedness and response, should be less fragmented or more, should be provide less duplication or more, be better or worse coordinated, be hopefully more efficient or less, and whether it's truly inclusive or not. And I think we need to find the right answer to these questions in order to be best or better prepared for the next crisis, midterm, short-term, and long-term to come. And these are tricky questions because it also clarifies that we need to look at the global health architecture and pandemic preparedness, not only through the lens of the Global Fund, not only through the lens of the WHO or through Gavi or whoever, but we need to see that in conjunctions. We need to clarify who's in charge of what, who's in the lead, who's not in the lead, who takes, how do we differentiate in between those mandates? And I think that's tricky. And that will certainly cause lots of friction and tension also in between the various constituencies who are potentially competing for the same finances. Coming to the finances, I know through a more capable colleague who is also part here that this year, just alone this year, we'll see replenishments in global health worth 50 billion. 50 billion. And that does not even include the fifth that Anbucha was referring to with the high amount of potentially $10 billion not even included, and not included the 600 million US dollar that are needed in order to adequately finance the WHO, to meet peanuts compared to all the other amounts we are talking about. So 50 billion, but it's important to realize that these 50 billion, if they come, if we are successful to raise them, will come from, to 99%, and I hope I cite the one colleague right, from 15 donors. 15 donors contribute to 99% of what is practically the global health architecture at this stage. So the big question is, what about everybody else? There is a huge number of free riders who are practically not contributing at all financially. And I think that's a huge challenge. That's a huge challenge for the Global Fund. It is a huge challenge for Gavi for the future, maybe not this year, but certainly in the future. How do we make sure that the emerging economies take their part, not only in articulating what their plans are to shape global health, but practically take on responsibility, not only through nice words and philosophic articles, but primarily also to, well, put the money down to the ground in order to support developing countries and the whole world to stay safe. I think that's a crucial debate that we need to have.
Perfect. I now ask Mr. Juan John or John Valadou. J'espère que je n'ai pas trop massacré votre nom. It's up to you for the next 2 minutes to intervene.
Many thanks, Charles. No, Johan is perfect, but don't worry. Thank you, and thank you so much, Björn, for this very strong point. And I really agree with what you said. Three or four things that I wanted to quickly share with you all on this question. First, in terms of what we could do, I think a key aspect is something which was said earlier, is to remind the pandemic is not over. We are still in a very vulnerable position, especially in the south. And as Gareth also highlighted, there is politically and in terms of attention a risk that the Ukraine crisis, for very legitimate reason, gathers energy. That this crisis leads to insufficient investment in global health. And when it comes to that, I think there are two main things to bear in mind. Absolutely, first is that multilateralism is a key dimension of our action. We are convinced of that, and as Europeans, we think that this multilateral response needs to be a European response. We'll come to that later on. And second, that solidarity is paramount. I think that this crisis, one of the lessons is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. We all know that. And I think politically speaking, in terms of also media, of message, it's a key aspect. Having said that, I think one of the key points also of this crisis and that could help us to move forward is to really underscore the fact that we need to be inclusive and we need to be in a partnership dynamic with all countries, in particular low and middle income countries. The idea that problems are in the south and solutions are in the north is clearly outdated, if it was ever outdated. So I think it's really an important point to bear in mind. And in that context, and with that spirit, we had in February earlier this year, this EU-AU summit, which was a key moment for renewed and a strengthened partnership between the two continents, on which specific commitments were made in terms of health on the short term, when it comes to vaccination against COVID in particular, and support to vaccination campaign on the ground to boost absorption capacities. On the middle term, with all the issue of production capacities and regulatory frameworks in particular. And on the longer term, with the need to strengthen health systems in African countries in particular. And lastly, I wanted also to echo what Björn said about global health financing. There is a donor issue. There is also how we make sure that the funding is optimal and rational. Some organizations have key replenishment moments, such as the Global Fund. Some do not. And for some issues, such as health system strengthening, such as One Health, we need to have more financing. And so we need collectively, I think, to think about global health financing and mechanism. And my last point would be really to promote a vision where we connect health with other SDGs. We know that the crisis was also a crisis in terms of gender inequality. The UN talked about shadow pandemic in that regard, about nutrition and many other things. So I think it's absolutely central to have a cross-cutting approach and to link global health with other SDGs as well, in particular gender. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now I am right, huh, John? We can already see the light at the end of the tunnel. Indeed, we are going to thematize the last set of questions. And the fourth question is the following: how to strengthen unified European voice in this debate? John, you are the first to intervene.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's really a central issue, because I think the Europeans, that we do have a specific vision when it comes to global health, the role of multilateralism, the role of the WHO, the role also of human rights, gender in how we want to work and to contribute to global health. So it's absolutely central that we have consolidate this vision. We know more than ever that global health is a geopolitical issue, and it was at the core of a meeting we organized last month in Lyon, a ministerial jumbo meeting of EU ministers of health and foreign affairs. And one of the most important goal was to strengthen the European strategy when it comes to global health. It was one of the deliverables of that meeting, to also exchange on how we can support more and better middle-income countries in their response to COVID-19, but also in other fields. We talked about the Global Fund, and Peter Sands was one of the speakers in that meeting. Confirm also the key role of the EU in strengthening the multilateral health architecture with the WHO as its center, and also systematically integrate and support issues such as the One Health approach that I also mentioned earlier. So for us, really, now is more than ever the time to promote that EU approach when it comes to global health, to have a common strategy, to systematize consultation and consolidation of our position before every important international event, even before, of course, board meetings at the Global Fund, at the Gavi board meeting as well, and of course, when it comes to WHO. This meeting in Lyon was followed later on by a specific meeting with ministers of health in Grenoble. And you know how much that dynamic has been important in the past 2 years. We decided to order vaccines against COVID-19 together between Europeans. We then organized a donation policy in support to COVAX together as Europeans. And all this has produced results. So I think one of the key challenges now is not to get back to normal pre-COVID-19 situation, but to take advantage of that and to consolidate this EU approach in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Second intervenant is Björn Kümmel.
So thank you. I would say I see two turning points for the EU's role in global health. The first one is already past, and sorry to say that, Garrett, it's the Brexit for the EU 27. Yeah, I think. Why am I saying that? Because practically with Brexit, the EU 28 lost one key protagonist of global health in its group, very well connected, very great network, etc. So back then, 7 consecutive presidencies, the Romanian, Finnish, but also the German, and now the French decided to set up a project which is called Strengthening the EU's Role in Global Health. And it's still ongoing, which practically evolves, why are we fighting below our abilities? Why are we not contributing as much as we can? Europe is a center of excellence and expertise, but for some reason, we are not as good as others to bring our experts to the decisions and to the discussions, but also we are not seen as a geopolitical power such as the US, China, India, Brazil, and others. So there's something wrong, although together we are the strongest financial contributor to global health. So in order to change that, that project, which is still ongoing, started, and it will be ongoing. I had exchanges with the Swedish upcoming presidency, so they are looking at that. The second turning point is now, and I think Brexit was a turning point for global health, but should have been for many other policy areas too. losing such a capable member state. The second turning point is now, and it's due to the crisis, to the ongoing crisis, Ukraine. And I think we will see that. We will see, well, a renaissance of the European spirit. We need to stand together in order to safeguard our principles and our visions. And that is true for all policy areas. It's true for defense, obviously, but it's also true for health. So I see that what we are lacking at this stage is not coordination. We are coordinating for every single WHO meeting. I think we are not coordinating for Global Fund and Gavi and many of the others for other reasons, but I think potentially that will come. Let's see. For WHO, we are doing that. My day at each World Health Assembly starts at 8 o'clock, sitting together with 26 other member states, coordinating our positions. So we are there with a strong voice. That certainly is there. What we are lacking is a common strategy. There's a paper from 2010, Council conclusions on global health. But I think, given the fact how global health evolved also through the ongoing pandemic, the EU needs to have a common vision, a common strategy, needs to know or, well, recognize again its principles and what it wants to contribute to global health. And I think that a strategy process is needed. It will take its time, not 1 year, maybe not 2 years, but even longer, but let's do that.
Thanks a lot. The last member to intervene is Gary Jenkins, please, 40 minutes.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, well, a couple of key points, really. Obviously, it's a political fact that the UK now sits outside the EU, but the unity that we've seen in the response to the Ukraine crisis has been so good to see. And it could mean that we could see greater cooperation around health security projects. And we should certainly aim to try to draw that cooperation into the field of health security and indeed to build the arguments, but draw together the security threats that are both defense-oriented as well as disease-oriented. So I think there's a task there for us to be helping to do that in the coming months, and for European actors to be working more closely in support of the Global Fund replenishment, in particular to do that. Also to recognise how the huge humanitarian crisis that is developing in Central and Eastern Europe and across the continent will also in great part be a health crisis as well, and recognising how those fit together too, as we advance arguments to governments. The last point I wanted to make was really also around just what a strong field of innovation European pharmaceuticals, European universities have as key actors in scientific innovation in the world. The role that our scientists has played in response to COVID is a key case in point. And that we know at Malaria No More and with some of our partners, just how this has resonated with public audiences. Indeed is a key way to engage public audiences with the need to invest in global health. And that what we should try to do is to build a greater collaboration between scientists, both so that they can advance the case for why the threat from future pandemics is very real and needs urgent action, but also to set out the optimistic case that within our grasp is the ability to tackle some of the key endemic diseases like malaria, TB and HIV, and make the world safer for everyone, including those directly affected, but also us here in Europe in the coming years. So yes, just a plea for us to remember our scientists across Europe and how important they are for this fight.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for your very pertinent, useful and helpful interventions. This exchange of views with outstanding experts is very helpful to me. It's a source of inspiration for me as member of the European Parliament. I would very much like to thank our three panelists for this very insightful discussion, which taught me a lot. I will now leave the floor to Mr. Stefano Vella for his concluding remarks.
Hello, friends of the Global Fund. Thank you very much. It's an honor to close this fantastic session. I don't have a lot to add. I think I would like to refer to what Michel said at the beginning. Of course, COVID-19 is not one in a century event. We need to expect something even worse. And of course, we need to be prepared. And we know how much we were unprepared. And what Michel showed very clearly is that COVID-19 was not a south of the world, as we call it in the past, event or catastrophe. It hit countries around the world, and maybe the richest were the more hit. So we need to be prepared. And being part of the Horizon Europe, let's say, group, I would like also to say what Anne Butcher said, that Europe actually is moving forward. And in a sense, I would like to link to the comments of my former colleagues about the fact that the Ukrainian crisis that is so devastating, let me say, is devastating our hearts, may push Europe to be more united, even in terms of global health, to understand that global health is one of the future, it's the actual and future problems of the world. So let me go back to sense. I think Peter said something very important. I don't like he do not like the issue of transition from pandemic to epidemic, you know, which is a false argument. We still have epidemics that kill like 2 or 3 million people every year. And the important thing is also that personally, I do not think that we need new instruments. We need to use the instruments we have. The Global Fund is doing something also for pandemic preparedness, of course. Working for the 3 diseases is working for pandemic preparedness. Now, will Europe be able to match the commitment of the US? I hope so. And of course, we need to avoid this cycle of between panic and neglect, as he said, panic and neglect. This is something that the human brain does sometimes, and this is a great mistake. So let me end by saying that the red ribbon of many interventions has been the inequalities. This is global health, actually. The global health is the fight against inequalities in health. And I think that this is the red ribbon that we need to keep in mind. We had inequalities in access to tools, and the Global Fund can help a lot on that, because the structure, the way the Global Fund is working may help, of course, for preparing the world to future pandemics that may come. Of course, let me say, we as the Friends, we issued a note regarding Ukraine. We are all devastated by this war, and of course, we just add that this is not only something that hits human living in Ukraine, but it's a global health issue also, because we know how much the health systems of the surrounding countries are weak to support the health of the refugees, and also in these countries, we know the impact of HIV and tuberculosis. So I think that the world is global. Let's hope that Europe finds a unity also in terms of global health. So I would like to thank you very much. It was very, very good. And I'm stopping here because we are in perfect time, almost in perfect time. So thank you very much, Christopher, to have arranged this fantastic webinar. Thank you very much. I think the floor is yours, Christopher, now to close it totally, or it's closed.
Stefano, you were the final speaker, so I declare the session closed now. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Many thanks all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.